Around 1905, a steel man in Pennsylvania was told by nearly every expert that his idea would never work. The beam he wanted to make was unproven, and one wrong move could sink his whole company. He heard the warnings and gambled anyway. Then he turned to his secretary and said, "If we are going bust, we will go bust big." His name was Charles Schwab, and he had just bet everything on a single shape of metal. That gamble is why the Golden Gate Bridge still stands. It put the beams inside the Empire State Building. Most of the New York skyline rose because of it. And here is the twist history rarely mentions. The man behind all of it died completely broke. If you have ever driven across a river and never thought about what held you up, this one is for you. So which city are you watching from? That is where we begin. To understand the size of that bet, you first have to understand the man who placed it. And Charles Schwab did not start at the top. He started at the very bottom of the American steel world, driving wooden stakes into the dirt for about $1 a day. In 1879, a 17-year-old from the small town of Loretto, Pennsylvania, took a job at a steelworks owned by Andrew Carnegie. His task was plain manual labor, pounding survey stakes into the ground for the engineering crew. But he was cheerful, quick, and impossible to overlook. He remembered names. He charmed everyone above him and everyone below him. Thomas Edison would later call him a master hustler, and it was not an insult. It was a description of a rare and dangerous gift. That gift carried him upward at a speed that stunned the people around him. By 19, he was assistant manager of the plant. When the plant superintendent died in an accident, young Schwab stepped in and ran the whole works. And when a bitter, violent labor war broke out at Carnegie's Homestead Mill, it was Schwab that Carnegie trusted to walk into the wreckage and rebuild the operation. He did it. By the age of 35, he was president of the Carnegie Steel Company, the most powerful steel firm in the nation. Then he pulled off the deal that made him a household name. In 1901, Schwab helped broker the sale of Carnegie's empire to the financier J.P. Morgan, combining it with rival firms to create U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation the world had ever seen. Schwab became its first president. He had climbed from $1 a day to the head of the largest company on earth in barely 2 decades. He should have been satisfied. But sitting at the head of a billion-dollar monopoly bored him, and the endless boardroom votes felt like a cage to a man who trusted his own gut over any committee. So in 1903, barely 2 years into the job, he walked away from the biggest corporation on earth to gamble his whole reputation on a company a fraction of its size, a small, unglamorous Pennsylvania firm he had quietly bought for himself, called Bethlehem Steel. At the time, it earned a little over $1 million a year. U.S. Steel was earning close to 100 times that. People thought he had lost his mind. But Schwab had seen something across the ocean that nobody else in America was willing to touch. And that vision is where the gamble truly begins. Bethlehem already had a proud, grim specialty. Decades earlier, it had become the birthplace of the American defense industry, forging the armor plate and the massive guns for the modern U.S. Navy. That work made steady money, but it tied the company's fate to warships and government contracts. Schwab wanted something bigger and more permanent, and he found it in an unproven process invented by an Englishman named Henry Gray. Gray had figured out how to roll a steel beam in one single piece, with a wide flange, a shape far stronger than anything in common use. Until then, the beams that held up buildings were riveted together from smaller parts, which limited how tall and how safely you could build. Gray's design could change all of that. There was only one problem. No one had ever mass-produced it, and nearly every expert in the industry believed it simply could not be done. Building a mill for it would cost around $5 million, a staggering sum for the time. And Bethlehem did not have that kind of money lying around. Investors were terrified. Schwab nearly backed out himself. Then he steadied, and in the line that would come to define him, he said that if the company was going to go bust, it would go bust big. He staked his own fortune, mortgaged the company's future, and personally talked the local railroads into extending him credit just to keep the gamble alive. And here is where a reckless wager turned into the skeleton of modern America. In 1908, Bethlehem began rolling the wide-flange beam, and it performed exactly as Gray had promised. Suddenly, builders had a material that was lighter, stronger, and cheaper than anything before it. You could reach far higher into the sky without the structure buckling under its own weight. The skyscraper, as we know it, became possible, not just as a dream on paper, but as something a developer could actually build and afford. And for years, Bethlehem was the only company on Earth that could make these beams, which meant that if you wanted to build tall in America, you came to Charles Schwab. They came in droves. The steel skeletons of the modern city began to rise straight out of Bethlehem's mills. But before the skyscrapers reached their full height, a far darker opportunity arrived, one that would make Schwab richer than he had ever imagined, and quietly stain the fortune at the same time. In 1914, war engulfed Europe. Bethlehem Steel already had those deep roots in armaments, and Schwab moved fast. He crossed the Atlantic again and again, more than 60 times by some accounts, returning from each voyage with enormous orders for guns, shells, and armor plate from Britain, France, and Russia. Much of it was sealed on nothing more than his handshake, because his word was considered as reliable as a signed contract. The scale was almost beyond belief. Bethlehem became a private arsenal for the Allied powers, and the money poured in like a flood. The numbers tell the story better than any description could. Bethlehem's stock climbed from around $45 a share to more than $700. The plant on the Lehigh River doubled and then quadrupled in size, becoming the center of the country for the making of cannon, projectiles, and armor plate. A company that had once been a rounding error next to U.S. Steel was now one of the most important manufacturers in the world, and by the end of the war, it stood as the largest arms supplier the nation had. Schwab's gamble had not merely paid off, it had made him one of the richest men in the country. When America itself entered the fight, the government even placed him in charge of a massive wartime shipbuilding effort, trusting the stake driver's son to help build the fleet. Yet the very habits that built his empire were already quietly digging its grave, and his own. Because Charles Schwab did not simply enjoy his wealth, he devoured it. He built a mansion in New York so enormous it filled an entire city block, with more than 90 bedrooms, 6 elevators, its own private power plant, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, and one of the largest pipe organs in the city. He bought a 44-room summer estate with a 9-hole golf course carved into the grounds. He gambled for punishing sums at the roulette tables of Monte Carlo, a favorite mistress often at his side. He co-signed $1 million in loans for so-called friends, most of which were never repaid, and quietly sent monthly allowances to 27 different people. Carnegie, his old mentor, had warned him about exactly this. The habit of speculation, the thrill of the bet, was the one flaw the disciplined Carnegie could never stomach in his brilliant protege. And it was about to matter more than anyone imagined. The First World War ended, the flood of arms orders dried up, and Schwab gradually handed the daily running of Bethlehem to his loyal deputy, Eugene Grace, while he settled into the role of elder statesman. He traveled, he gambled, he charmed reporters and kings alike. But the fortune that had come out of steel was now flowing away faster than it flowed in. And the skyscrapers kept climbing without him. Those beams built the icons everyone knows. At the end of the 1920s, New York was gripped by a race to the sky, as rival developers competed to raise the tallest building on Earth, each one certain his tower could not be topped. That contest, and the skyline it produced, was only possible because a strong, mass-produced structural steel now existed to make it real. Bethlehem metal went into frame after frame. Its steel would brace Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria, Madison Square Garden, the Chicago Merchandise Mart, and the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington. Out west, its fabricating arm built the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge. Tens of thousands of tons of it hauled across the country and hung between 2 towers over open water. Back east, that same arm braced the George Washington Bridge that ties New York to New Jersey, and the Benjamin Franklin Bridge stretching across the Delaware. By some estimates, without Bethlehem Steel, roughly 80% of the New York City skyline would not stand as it does today. The company had quietly become the spine of the country. And then, in 1929, the stock market collapsed. The man who had forged the skeleton of the American economy was about to learn that his own fortune was built on sand. The crash devoured Schwab's speculative investments. The Great Depression that followed crushed the value of nearly everything he owned. The man who had made the beams that held up the American skyline could no longer pay the property taxes on his own mansion. He tried to sell the great house for a fraction of what it had cost him, and found no takers. A palace nobody wanted in a broken economy. He even offered it to the city of New York as an official residence for the mayor, and the mayor turned it down as far too grand for a public servant. By the end, the richest steel man in America was living in a small rented apartment, surviving on borrowed money. When Charles Schwab died in 1939, he was more than $300,000 in debt, and his once mighty holdings in Bethlehem Steel had become essentially worthless. Among the last possessions logged in his Pennsylvania estate were an old automobile that sold for $20 and a set of carpenter's tools that fetched $4. And here is the twist that borders on genuine tragedy. Had Schwab lived just a few years longer, he would have watched his company rescued by the very force that first made it great: war. As the Second World War erupted, the orders came roaring back, larger than anything the first had produced. Bethlehem's shipyards became a genuine miracle of production, turning out nearly 1,100 ships for the war effort, an average of one brand new vessel every 2 weeks. The company built aircraft carriers, cargo ships, and warships that carried America across 2 oceans, and it poured out the armor and ordnance that armed a nation at war. At its wartime peak, Bethlehem was a colossus, and it would eventually employ more than 160,000 people. Whole towns lived and breathed by its shifts. A single factory job there could send 3 children to college, and generations of the same family clocked in through the same gates. The man who bet everything to build it never lived to see its greatest hour. But even a giant this large was standing on a foundation that had already begun to rot. For a while, nothing on earth could touch it. In the years right after the Second World War, American mills produced the majority of all the steel on the planet, and Bethlehem sat near the very top of that mountain, pouring out tens of millions of tons a year. The company looked, for a moment, eternal. That very sense of permanence turned out to be the poison. Confident and comfortable, Bethlehem and the rest of American steel grew slow to change. They clung to older methods, while newer, hungrier mills overseas embraced cheaper and faster technology. By the late 1960s, foreign steel was landing on American shores priced well below what Bethlehem could match. The giant kept assuming its dominance was permanent, right up until the moment it plainly was not, and once the decline began in earnest, it moved with frightening speed. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, the losses stacked up, and the layoffs came in waves. A workforce that had once passed 160,000 shrank year after year, even as the company still owed pensions and health care to tens of thousands of retirees who had given their working lives to the mills. Those legacy costs, piled on top of falling sales and aging plants, became a weight no amount of proud history could lift. When the business legend Jack Welch was later asked whether he could have saved Bethlehem, he replied that he did not think Christ himself could have saved it. Then came the final shock. In the first 9 months of a single year, the company bled nearly $1.5 billion, and after the attacks of September 2001, a slow decline turned into a freefall. That October, Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy. 2 years later, the company was dissolved, its surviving mills swallowed by a larger group and eventually folded into a foreign-owned giant. But the coldest blow of all landed on the workers. In the bankruptcy, the company was permitted to shed its obligations to its own retirees. A federal agency took over the underfunded pensions at reduced levels, and the health and life insurance benefits that many workers had been promised were terminated outright. Men who had spent 40 years making the steel that built America watched the guarantees made to them legally erased in a courtroom. The workers who poured the metal for the bridges and the towers were treated, in the end, as just another disposable line on a balance sheet. In Bethlehem itself, the great blast furnaces finally went cold and silent. A retired worker described the hardest part not as the lost paychecks, but as the quiet, no more whistles, no more horns, none of the sound that had defined the town for a century. The place that had once run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, simply stopped. And yet the story does not end in rubble. It ends in something stranger and somehow more fitting. The rusting furnaces in Bethlehem were never torn down. They still stand today, floodlit against the night sky, at a cultural campus called Steel Stacks, where concerts and festivals now fill the ground where armor plate and skyscraper beams were once born. In Baltimore, at the old Sparrows Point Mill, retirees still light a steel star every Christmas, the very same star the company first raised in 1978, refusing to let the memory die. Think about the strange symmetry of it. The man died broke in 1939, just before the war that would have made him rich again. The company died in 2001, long after the country stopped needing it the way it once had. Both the builder and the thing he built were ruined by the same restless faith that nothing good ever ends. And yet the steel itself outlived them both. It is still holding up the bridges, still standing inside the bones of the tallest towers, still carrying the weight of a country that has mostly forgotten where it came from. The next time you drive across a great bridge, remember it holds you up on a dead man's gamble. But here is what still haunts me. How many other everyday giants are quietly vanishing right now, unnoticed? Tell us the forgotten company you think deserves this story in the comments.